When war reached the frozen edge, the first sign came not with a siren, but with silence. On a fog-choked morning in June 1942, radar operators in Alaska's remote Aleutian Islands picked up faint echoes over the sea, a formation of aircraft approaching from the west. The men squinted at their screens, unsure if the readings were real or just tricks of the storm. Minutes later, the answer came in thunder. Bombs began to fall on Dutch Harbor. Explosions shook the frozen cliffs, black smoke mingling with the ever-present fog. America's northern frontier, a place of fishermen, Aleut villagers, and icy winds, was suddenly a battlefield. The war had come home. Few Americans knew it at the time, but the Aleutian campaign would become one of the most brutal, least-known chapters of World War II. It was a war fought not only against a determined enemy, but also against nature itself, where men froze before they ever fired a shot, and where the line between land and sea, ally and adversary, blurred beneath the clouds. The Forgotten Front. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the shock reverberated across the Pacific. The United States braced for invasion, but few imagined that the next target would be Alaska, a land so cold, so isolated, it was thought untouchable. But Tokyo saw it differently. Japan's military believed that seizing Alaska's Aleutian Islands, a thin chain of volcanic rock stretching toward Asia, could block America's northern approach and threaten the U.S. mainland. Moreover, the move would divert American attention from Japan's true objective, the invasion of Midway. In June 1942, as Japanese carriers struck Midway in the Central Pacific, a smaller task force sailed north under a cloak of fog. Their destination, the Aleutians. Within days, Japanese troops landed on the islands of Attu and Kiska, marking the first foreign occupation of U.S. soil since the War of 1812. The United States, stunned and humiliated, suddenly realized that war was no longer an ocean away. It had arrived at the frozen edge of home. A land of hostile beauty. For the soldiers sent to reclaim the Aleutians, Alaska was an enemy of its own. The islands were shrouded in fog for nearly 300 days a year, whipped by winds so fierce they could hurl planes into mountains. Rain and snow fell sideways, mud swallowed vehicles whole, visibility often dropped to zero. As one soldier later recalled, the Aleutians weren't a battlefield, they were a punishment. The troops came from all corners of America, Texans, New Yorkers, and Midwesterners who had never seen a glacier before. They arrived wearing thin uniforms, expecting a quick fight, only to find themselves trapped in a landscape that seemed to determine to kill them. Frostbite, trench foot, and pneumonia spread faster than bullets. Weapons rusted in the damp air. Even compasses malfunctioned, magnetic fields distorted by the volcanic rock. And through it all, somewhere in the mist, the Japanese waited. The Battle for Attu. In May 1943, nearly a year after the Japanese invasion, the United States launched Operation Land Crab, a mission to retake Attu Island, the westernmost point of the Aleutians. The plan looked simple on paper. Land troops, overwhelm the enemy, reclaim the island. But when the 7th Infantry Division landed on Attu's beaches, they found no clear resistance, only eerie silence and endless fog. Then the mountains came alive. Japanese snipers fired from ridgelines invisible through the mist. Mortars rained down from cliffs. The Americans advanced inch by inch, slipping on mud and ice, their rifles freezing in their hands. Many died not from gunfire, but from exposure. It was a battle fought at the limits of human endurance. Supplies could only arrive by air, and wounded men had to be carried for miles through snowdrifts. Food froze solid. Medics used their body heat to thaw plasma for transfusions. For weeks, the fighting dragged on, a brutal dance of ambush and counterattack. Finally, on May 29, 1943, the Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuyaki Yamasaki, launched one final desperate charge. In what became one of the largest banzai attacks of the Pacific War, nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers stormed the American lines with bayonets and grenades, screaming war cries as they fell. The Americans, caught off guard, fought hand-to-hand in the freezing dawn. By the end of the day, the ground was soaked in blood and snow. Almost every Japanese soldier was dead. Out of roughly 2,500 defenders, only 28 were taken alive. Attu was back in American hands, but at a terrible cost. Over 3,800 U.S. troops were killed, wounded, or sickened during the battle.
The ghosts of Kiska. 2 months later, the Allies turned their attention to Kiska Island, expecting another bloodbath. Over 34,000 American and Canadian soldiers, supported by warships and bombers, prepared to storm the island. They landed under heavy fog, weapons ready, only to find nothing. The Japanese were gone. Unbeknownst to the Allies, Japan had secretly evacuated Kiska weeks earlier under the cover of fog, slipping through the blockade undetected. The Americans, unaware, fought the terrain instead of the enemy. In the confusion, friendly fire erupted. Soldiers shot at shadows, mines exploded underfoot, and ships shelled empty hillsides. By the time it was over, nearly 300 Allied troops were dead, victims of weather, accidents, and mistaken fire. The Aleutian campaign had ended, not with victory cheers, but with exhaustion. The islands were reclaimed, yet they left behind a haunting silence. The hidden war. While the battles raged, another quiet struggle unfolded behind the scenes, one of intelligence, logistics, and endurance. Engineers carved airstrips into permafrost, turning remote tundra into launching pads for long-range bombers. The U.S. Navy used the Aleutians as a testing ground for radar, weather forecasting, and Arctic survival, technologies that would later shape the Cold War. Codebreakers in Anchorage intercepted Japanese transmissions, mapping enemy positions before the strikes. In many ways, the Aleutian Front became an experimental theater, a proving ground for tactics later used across the Pacific. Yet despite its strategic value, the campaign was soon forgotten. When the war ended, headlines celebrated D-Day and Iwo Jima, not Attu or Kiska. The men who fought there returned home to find few people even knew where the Aleutians were. The Aleuts, a forgotten people. Lost amid the clash of empires were the Aleut people, Alaska's indigenous inhabitants. When Japan invaded, hundreds of Aleut villagers were caught in the crossfire. Those on Attu were taken prisoner and sent to camps in Japan, where many died of disease and starvation. Those in other villages were forcibly relocated by the U.S. government to internment camps in southeast Alaska, their homes left to decay. When the war ended, the survivors returned to find their villages burned or abandoned. Their story, too, faded into silence, a forgotten chapter of a forgotten war. Nature's lasting hold. Even after the guns went silent, Alaska's frozen edge refused to let go of its ghosts. Decades later, explorers and archaeologists still find remnants of the Aleutian War. Rusted helmets buried in moss, bullet casings embedded in cliffs, and aircraft wrecks preserved by the cold. On Attu, wildflowers now bloom where soldiers once fell. The island is uninhabited, its beaches littered with relics, spent cartridges, sake bottles, and weathered crosses. In 2017, the remains of Private Donald Schultz, missing since 1943, were finally recovered and brought home.
His return marked one of the last acts of closure for a generation nearly erased by ice and time. Legacy of the Frozen Front. The Aleutian campaign taught the U.S. military lessons it would never forget. It proved that war could come from any direction, that geography could be both shield and trap, and that nature could be as deadly as any enemy. It also transformed Alaska's role in national defense. After the war, the region became a strategic stronghold during the Cold War, home to radar stations, missile silos, and airfields watching over the Arctic. The ghosts of Attu and Kiska became guardians of a new era of vigilance. Yet for the men who fought there, the memories remained frozen, not in the pages of textbooks, but in the silence between wind and snow. Echoes across the ice. Today, when storms roll in over the Aleutians, the fog still moves like smoke over forgotten graves. Locals say that sometimes, in the howl of the wind, you can hear the faint sound of boots crunching on gravel, soldiers still marching through the mist. The Aleutian Islands stand as America's least known battlefield, where heroism met hardship, and where victory came not from triumph, but from endurance. It was a war without glory, fought at the edge of the world. But it was also proof that even in the coldest, loneliest corners of Earth, the spirit of resistance burns hot enough to melt the ice of history. Because when war reached the frozen edge, America fought back.
The battle for the Aleutians. The sea was a wall of fog, the wind a living thing that screamed across the frozen waves. In the summer of 1942, while the world's eyes were fixed on the burning skies of Europe and the Pacific, a quieter, stranger war was beginning, one so remote that few Americans even knew it existed. But here, in Alaska's Aleutian Islands, the enemy had landed. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that U.S. soil had fallen under foreign occupation, and it would become one of the most brutal, least-known campaigns of World War II, a battle where soldiers fought not only the Japanese Empire, but the merciless hand of nature itself. The invasion no one saw coming. In June 1942, 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a twin assault. One fleet headed toward Midway, hoping to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Another, smaller force sailed north toward a chain of volcanic islands stretching like broken teeth across Alaska's southwestern horizon, the Aleutians. For Japan, the plan was simple: seize the islands of Attu and Kiska, secure a foothold in North America, and divert U.S. attention away from Midway. For the United States, it was an unthinkable breach, the homeland itself under attack. The first strike came on June 3, 1942, when Japanese aircraft bombed Dutch Harbor, a small naval outpost on Unalaska Island. Explosions tore through fuel tanks and barracks. American sailors scrambled to return fire, their guns nearly useless in the blinding fog. 2 days later, Japanese troops waded ashore on Attu and Kiska, planting the rising sun flag in the frozen soil. When the news reached Washington, disbelief turned to anger. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding U.S. forces in Alaska, vowed, "The enemy has taken a piece of America. We will take it back." But first, they had to survive it. The land that hated men. The Aleutian Islands were unlike any other battlefield on Earth, a place of eternal fog and wind, where cliffs plunged into freezing seas and volcanoes slept beneath blankets of snow. Temperatures dropped below zero even in summer, and storms rolled in without warning. For the Japanese soldiers who occupied Attu and Kiska, it was hell. Their supply ships were hunted by American submarines, and food was so scarce that some resorted to eating leather and roots. But for the Americans who came to retake the islands, it was no better. When the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division landed on Attu in May 1943, the soldiers were dressed for the North African desert, not the Arctic. Their boots leaked, their tents froze, and their rifles jammed from the cold. As one soldier later said, "It wasn't the Japanese we feared, it was the wind." Snow blinded them, fog swallowed entire companies, and frostbite became as deadly as bullets. The terrain, jagged, muddy, and treacherous, turned every step into a battle. Operation Land Crab. On May 11, 1943, the U.S. Navy began bombarding Attu, softening the beaches for the invasion. Then came Operation Land Crab, a name that would prove grimly accurate. Thousands of troops crawled onto the shore through knee-deep mud, advancing like crabs under a curtain of fog. The Japanese, entrenched in the mountains, fired down from invisible ridges. Every inch of progress cost blood. Visibility was so poor that soldiers sometimes stumbled into enemy lines without realizing it. When the fog lifted, it revealed a landscape that looked more like the moon than Earth. Craters, wrecked landing craft, and bodies frozen in grotesque shapes. Attu's battle became a nightmare of attrition. Supply lines froze, food spoiled, and wounded men had to be carried for miles through snow. Medics worked in unheated tents, thawing plasma packets over fires. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, ordered his men to fight to the last. Surrender was unthinkable. Hidden bunkers and sniper nests turned every hill into a death trap. When Americans captured one ridge, they found it stacked with corpses, both sides mixed together, unrecognizable beneath frost and blood. The final charge. After nearly 2 weeks of grinding combat, only a few hundred Japanese soldiers remained. On the morning of May 29, 1943, Yamasaki gathered his men for one final act, a suicidal banzai charge that would go down as one of the largest of the Pacific War. At dawn, the fog lifted to reveal a ghostly sight. Hundreds of Japanese troops, bayonets fixed, charging through the snow with screams of defiance. They crashed into the American lines with ferocious speed, overrunning trenches, stabbing, firing, and fighting hand to hand. For several hours, chaos reigned. Communications broke down. Medics dropped stretchers to pick up rifles. Even cooks and clerks joined the fight. By afternoon, it was over. The field was silent again. Littered with bodies, the snow turned crimson. Of the 2,500 Japanese soldiers who had defended Attu, only 28 were taken prisoner. The rest had chosen death. The victory cost America dearly. More than 3,800 U.S. troops were killed, wounded, or sickened by frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. Attu was back in American hands, but at a price few could comprehend.
The empty island of Kiska. With Attu secured, the Allies turned to Kiska, expecting a similar bloodbath. American and Canadian forces, nearly 34,000 strong, launched the largest combined amphibious landing of the Northern War in August 1943. They stormed the beaches through fog and rain, bracing for ambush. Gunfire echoed in the distance. Mines exploded beneath their boots. For 2 days the battle raged. until scouts made a shocking discovery. There were no Japanese. Weeks earlier, under the cover of fog, Japan had secretly evacuated all 5,000 troops from Kiska using destroyers and submarines. The Allies had invaded an empty island. But the fog, mines, and confusion proved deadly nonetheless. Friendly fire broke out as soldiers mistook each other for the enemy. Explosions ripped through supply lines. By the time the battle ended, nearly 300 Allied troops were dead, victims of accidents, weather, and fear. The Aleutian campaign had come to a strange and tragic end. The human cost and the forgotten people. Lost in the storm of battle were the Aleuts, Alaska's indigenous inhabitants. When Japan invaded, Aleut villagers from Attu were taken prisoner and shipped to Japan, where many died from starvation and disease. Those living on nearby islands were forcibly relocated by the U.S. government to internment camps in southeast Alaska, crowded, unsanitary places where dozens perished. When they returned after the war, they found their homes looted or destroyed. For them, the war never truly ended. It left wounds deeper than any bullet. Alaska's hidden frontline. The Aleutian campaign might have been small compared to Normandy or Iwo Jima, but its impact was immense. It forced the United States to fortify Alaska, transforming it from a forgotten territory into a strategic frontier. Airfields, radar stations, and naval bases sprang up across the region. The experience gained in surviving Arctic warfare helped shape Cold War defenses and the later construction of the D-Line, a network of radar outposts that watched for Soviet bombers. For historians, the Aleutians became a case study in resilience, a reminder that nature itself can be a formidable enemy. The battle that time forgot. When the war ended, newspapers celebrated victories in Europe and the Pacific. The soldiers who fought in Alaska returned home to find their struggle all but forgotten. There were no parades, no Hollywood movies, just memories of mud, wind, and endless fog. It wasn't until decades later that the world began to rediscover the Aleutian campaign. Memorials were erected on Attu, where wildflowers now grow among rusted helmets and broken rifles. In 2017, the island was designated a National Historic Landmark, though few visitors ever reach its shores. Even today, the wind still carries echoes of that forgotten war. Locals claim that on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick and low, you can hear faint shouts, the ghosts of Attu soldiers still fighting in the mist. Legacy of ice and honor. The battle for the Aleutians stands as one of the most remarkable and least known episodes of American history, a fight that tested the limits of endurance and courage. It proved that war could strike even the most isolated corners of the world, and that victory sometimes comes not through firepower, but through sheer will to survive. Those who fought there, Americans, Canadians, Aleuts, and even their adversaries, shared a bond forged in the cold, the understanding that in the face of nature's wrath, all men are equally small. Today, the Aleutian Islands remain one of America's quietest battlefields, their peaks still scarred by bunkers and bomb craters, their coasts littered with the remains of ships and planes. And though the war has long since ended, the land remembers. Because on those fog-shrouded islands, where the sea meets the sky and the wind never stops howling, the echoes of 1942 still linger. Reminders of the time when America's frozen frontier became the front line
of freedom.
The land that fought back. The Aleutian fog rolled in thick and silent, swallowing the horizon. Lieutenant James McAllister squinted against the biting wind, the taste of salt and ice biting his cheeks. Somewhere beneath that gray veil, an enemy awaited, but the land itself seemed more formidable than any foe. Alaska was not just a backdrop for war, it was a living, breathing adversary. Every step forward was a battle against nature before it ever touched human hands. In June 1942, the world's attention was drawn to grand theaters of war: Normandy, Guadalcanal, Midway. But thousands of miles to the north, a quieter struggle unfolded. Japanese forces, emboldened by their victories across the Pacific, made landfall on the Aleutian islands of Attu and Kiska. The U.S. military suddenly faced the grim realization that America's own soil was under occupation for the first time since the War of 1812. Yet Alaska was no ordinary battlefield. Snowstorms could rise without warning, swallowing soldiers and supplies alike. Winds howled with a ferocity that bent trees and shredded tents. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and even lives before combat could begin. Aircraft struggled against the icy gusts, engines sputtering in the thin, cold air. Maps became almost useless, topographical features vanished under relentless snow. Soldiers often joked bitterly that if they survived the terrain, they might survive the enemy. The 1943 Aleutian campaign would become a test not only of military strategy, but of human endurance. American troops, primarily from the 7th Infantry Division and elements of the U.S. Army Air Forces, faced logistical nightmares. Supply ships frequently turned back, beaten by storms or mined waters. Radio communications faltered, and reconnaissance planes sometimes never returned. The soldiers' letters home often described a war not of gunfire alone, but of ice, wind, and isolation. Lieutenant McAllister remembered one morning in particular. He and his men were moving across a ridge on Attu when a sudden whiteout descended. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Soldiers froze mid-step, struggling to maintain formation. One misstep meant plummeting into hidden ravines or rivers turned ice traps. That day, the enemy never appeared, yet McAllister considered it one of the most dangerous moments of his life. The land itself demanded respect and discipline. Despite these conditions, American forces pushed forward, determined to reclaim the islands. Every inch of territory required painstaking effort. Bulldozers couldn't clear paths fast enough. Soldiers dug trenches by hand in frozen soil, often only to have their work buried by nightly blizzards. When artillery was deployed, the cold congealed lubricants and jammed mechanisms. Casualties mounted not from enemy fire alone, but from exhaustion, hypothermia, and frostbite. Yet there were moments of human ingenuity that shone through the Arctic gloom. Engineers designed improvised snow shelters, sometimes called Quonset huts, that could withstand relentless wind. Pilots modified planes with de-icing equipment. Supply crews invented sled systems and catapults to move heavy ammunition across frozen marshes. Even the most minor adaptations became acts of survival, small victories against a seemingly unyielding adversary. The Aleutian campaign also highlighted the resilience of native Alaskan guides and scouts. Their knowledge of the island's hidden paths, frozen streams, and sudden weather patterns proved invaluable. Corporal Yukio Toshima, a scout of Aleut descent, led troops through narrow valleys invisible on maps, helping them avoid deadly pitfalls. His guidance often meant the difference between life and death. In many ways, it was these unsung figures who tamed the land enough to allow the soldiers to fight. On May 11, 1943, the Americans landed on Attu. The battle that followed was brutal and unforgiving. Japanese forces had entrenched themselves in bunkers and caves, using the terrain as a weapon. Machine gun nests were hidden behind snowbanks. Artillery was camouflaged by icy ridges. Attu was transformed into a maze of death where each engagement required careful navigation against both enemy fire and treacherous terrain. One particularly harrowing moment occurred near Chichagof Harbor.
A platoon, advancing under heavy fire, found themselves trapped on a narrow ridge. With Japanese snipers targeting them from concealed bunkers and a blizzard reducing visibility to zero, retreat was impossible. Sergeant William Harris ordered his men to dig in with whatever tools they had: shovels, bayonets, even their hands. By dawn, they had created makeshift defenses, their breaths frozen into icicles on their uniforms. Miraculously, they held the ridge until reinforcements arrived. Stories like these were repeated across the campaign. Courage matched by endurance, human tenacity pitted against the unforgiving elements.
The Japanese, too, were tested by Alaska's wrath. On Kiska, when American forces landed in August 1943 expecting fierce resistance, they discovered the enemy had quietly evacuated under cover of fog. The land itself aided the retreat, masking movement and confounding reconnaissance. It was a subtle reminder that in the Aleutians, victory was never straightforward. The land could be both a shield and a trap. By the time the campaign ended, the cost was staggering. Hundreds of soldiers had died in combat, but many more succumbed to frostbite, exposure, and disease. The Aleutians had proven that nature could be as formidable as any human adversary. Yet in the aftermath, the U.S. military gained invaluable experience in cold weather warfare. Techniques, strategies, and lessons learned in Alaska would later influence Arctic operations in Korea and beyond. Historians often overlook the Aleutian Islands in the grand narrative of World War II, but for those who fought there, the land was never a passive stage. It was an active participant. The mountains, wind, and ice shaped every decision, every maneuver, and every casualty. Soldiers spoke of it with a mixture of awe and dread, often calling it the land that fought back. And in many ways, they were right. Lieutenant McAllister, years later, reflected on the campaign. We were fighting men, but also fighting Alaska. Every step, every storm, it demanded more than courage. It demanded respect. The Aleutians did not surrender easily, nor did they yield their secrets without cost. Yet the campaign proved that determination, ingenuity, and endurance could conquer even the harshest landscapes. Today, the Aleutian Islands stand quiet, scarred but resilient. The bunkers and foxholes remain, frozen monuments to a battle where the environment was both an enemy and an ally. Visitors often marvel at the beauty, but those who know history see a land that fought and a people who fought back with equal ferocity. Alaska's icy expanse may seem tranquil now, but during those pivotal months of 1942-1943, it was alive with struggle, survival, and triumph. In the end, the Aleutian campaign was a lesson in humility. Nature's power can rival human ambition, but human courage can rise to meet it. The land did not yield easily, and it exacted its toll. But America, and the soldiers who endured its harsh embrace, learned that resilience, ingenuity, and respect for the elements could turn even the coldest adversary into a proving ground for heroism. The land had fought back, but so had they.
Secrets in the sky, the forgotten pilots. The sky over Alaska looked serene, almost peaceful, as Captain Robert "Bobby" Harlan gripped the yoke of his P-39 Airacobra. Below him, the frozen tundra stretched endlessly, a mosaic of snow, ice, and shadowed ridges. But the calm was deceptive. Each mile he flew carried risk, not just from mechanical failure or enemy interception, but from the invisible threat of the elements themselves. Here, in these windswept expanses, history was quietly being written, and often forgotten. During World War II, a covert lifeline stretched from the United States to the Soviet Union, the Lend-Lease route, known to pilots and strategists alike as the ALSIB corridor. Its purpose was simple yet monumental: ferry American aircraft across North America, through the remote reaches of Alaska, and into Soviet hands. The mission was born of necessity. The Soviet Union needed planes to resist the relentless German advance on the Eastern Front, and the United States had the factories to supply them. The plan, however, relied on a daring chain of men who would navigate some of the harshest skies on the planet. The first challenge was geography. Alaska's landscape was a treacherous labyrinth of mountains, glaciers, and tundra. There were no highways, no reliable maps, and certainly no modern navigation systems. Pilots relied on compasses, dead reckoning, and sometimes sheer instinct. Whiteouts could appear without warning, turning the sky into a blank canvas where orientation became impossible. The smallest miscalculation could send a plane crashing into frozen peaks or disappearing into the Arctic night. On a frigid February morning in 1943, Lieutenant Harlan prepared for what would be his fourth ferry flight. His cargo? A brand new Bell P-39 Airacobra, stripped of non-essential weight to extend its range. The mission was routine on paper. Fly from Great Falls, Montana to Nome, Alaska, and hand the aircraft over to Soviet crews for onward delivery. But no flight was ever truly routine. Harlan knew the statistics. Hundreds of pilots had vanished over these skies. Their planes never recovered. Official reports labeled them lost in transit, but the truth was often far grimmer. As Harlan ascended, the engines of his plane whining against the thin air, he marveled at the scale of the operation. Alongside him, other pilots traced invisible corridors across the north, each flight a thread weaving a silent alliance between two nations whose soldiers would never meet. Soviet mechanics waiting at remote airstrips worked in near isolation, repairing and readying planes that had braved hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. The entire enterprise was a ballet of precision, courage, and secrecy. Yet danger lurked at every turn. In the early months of the Lend-Lease operations, navigational errors and harsh weather claimed dozens of aircraft. A sudden storm over the Brooks Range could bury a plane in snow before a distress signal could be sent. One of the most infamous incidents involved a group of 20 planes flying in formation. A single misjudged course over a mountain pass led to 5 crashing within hours of each other. Survivors spoke of bitter cold, broken radio equipment, and the eerie silence that followed, broken only by the sound of wind through twisted metal. Harlan had his own brushes with death. On a flight across the Tanana River Valley, he was caught in a sudden ice storm. Visibility dropped to near zero, and his altimeter began to fluctuate wildly. For hours he fought the controls, sweating despite the sub-zero temperature, until he finally spotted the faint outline of an airstrip. He landed with frozen hands and a racing heart. That night, huddled in a tent with other pilots, he scribbled in his logbook, "The land itself is our enemy here. Not Germany, not Japan. Alaska will take what it wants, and we are only borrowing it."
But danger wasn't limited to the weather. Mechanical failures, fatigue, and the thin margin of human error made each flight a gamble. Pilots were trained quickly, sometimes with as little as 10 hours of instrument experience, and then sent into the Arctic skies with no backup. The Soviet Union received planes in pieces or partially assembled. The Americans relied on precise coordination to ensure deliveries. A single miscalculation in fuel consumption or route planning could strand a plane in the wilderness, leaving its pilot to endure isolation, starvation, and freezing temperatures. One of the lesser-known tragedies occurred on March 15, 1944. A young pilot named Ensign Carl Whitaker departed from Fairbanks with a shipment of P-63 King Cobras. Hours into the flight, a sudden blizzard engulfed his plane. Radio contact was lost, and search teams were unable to locate him. Weeks later, a team discovered wreckage half buried in snow near the southern flank of the Alaska Range. Whitaker's sacrifice was quietly recorded, a footnote in military archives, but his courage, like that of many forgotten aviators, was monumental. Despite the risks, the pilots formed an unspoken bond with the land. They learned to read the winds, to anticipate the ice storms, to navigate by subtle changes in the tundra below. They shared stories in remote outposts, of ghostly auroras illuminating the night, of frozen rivers that could carry their planes across valleys if approached carefully, of abandoned villages that had witnessed decades of isolation. Every flight became a lesson in humility, reminding them that survival required more than skill.
It required respect for a world that could swallow them whole. By late 1944, the Lend-Lease route had transported thousands of aircraft. Fighter planes, bombers, and transport aircraft crossed the Arctic skies, each flight a testament to coordination and courage. American pilots delivered machines that would bolster Soviet defenses, often without fanfare, medals, or recognition. Many would return home to quiet lives, their stories buried in classified reports or lost in the anonymity of war. Yet the alliance forged in the clouds of Alaska played a crucial role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Among the Soviet recipients was Captain Ivan Petrov, who recalled the first time he flew an American P-39. "It was like holding lightning in my hands," he said decades later. "We trusted the Americans to send it safely, and in turn we trusted it to survive us. Every flight was a leap of faith. That faith extended beyond nations. It was a human trust, forged between pilots, engineers, mechanics, and the land itself." The risks were sometimes absurdly mundane as well. Pilots battled frostbite severe enough to blacken extremities, navigational instruments frozen or miscalibrated by extreme cold, and the psychological toll of long, silent hours in an unforgiving cockpit. Yet there was camaraderie in shared hardship, the exchange of hot tea at makeshift airstrips, letters folded into the layers of jackets for warmth, stories passed from one flight crew to another. They were soldiers of the sky, and Alaska was both their battlefield and their teacher. As the war drew to a close, the Lend-Lease route slowed, leaving behind a legacy that few in the West remembered. Countless pilots were missing from official histories. Many had perished in silence, their flights never documented in detail. Alaska's frozen corridors had witnessed feats of endurance, courage, and sacrifice that rivaled any battlefield. The men who had flown them returned home quietly, their tales often met with polite nods rather than the applause they deserved. Captain Harlan survived the war, eventually retiring to a small town in Montana. Yet he never forgot the skies of Alaska, the endless expanse of white and wind, and the silent alliance that had carried hope across continents. "We were shadows in the clouds," he said, reflecting on his missions decades later. "No headlines, no glory, just the frozen sky and the lives we carried across it." The story of the Lend-Lease pilots reminds us that history is not only shaped on the front lines of battlefields, but also in the quiet corridors of the sky. Alaska, with its treacherous mountains and frozen rivers, was a crucible that tested the limits of human courage and ingenuity. The pilots who navigated those invisible highways risked everything, yet their names often vanish in the footnotes of history. Today, monuments in Fairbanks and Nome commemorate the bravery of those who flew the Lend-Lease route. Scholars and aviation enthusiasts dig through archives, piecing together flight logs and personal journals, trying to honor the forgotten pilots whose courage turned isolation into a lifeline. The skies remain quiet, but if one listens closely on a clear winter night, some claim they can hear the distant roar of engines that once carried hope across continents. In the end, Alaska taught them that the true enemy was not just war itself, but the combination of human vulnerability and nature's merciless power. And yet, the pilots survived, adapted, and persevered. They were ghosts in the sky, carrying not only planes, but trust, hope, and the fragile thread of international alliance. High above the tundra, the winds continued to whisper secrets of courage and sacrifice, of men who vanished in snow, but left indelible marks on history. The skies remember them, even if the world below has almost forgotten. These were the forgotten pilots, the invisible guardians of an alliance, the silent heroes of a war that spanned continents. Alaska was their crucible, their challenge, and their witness, and the sky itself kept their secrets.
The cold front of espionage. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows of the Anchorage Intelligence Office, carrying with it the icy breath of the Bering Sea. Inside, Lieutenant Margaret Maggie Collins huddled over a stack of coded messages, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Every character, every dash, every symbol could mean the difference between life and death hundreds of miles away on the Aleutian front. Outside, the world might have seen Alaska as a frozen wilderness at the edge of the nation, but inside, it was the center of a silent war, waged not with guns and tanks, but with brains, intuition, and courage. In the summer of 1942, while American and Japanese forces clashed across the Aleutian Islands, a parallel battle unfolded thousands of feet above and deep within Alaska's icy terrain. Japanese reconnaissance planes flew over Attu and Kiska, mapping U.S. positions, sending coded radio transmissions back across the Pacific. Every intercepted signal was a potential clue, every decoded phrase a step closer to preventing catastrophe. Anchorage became a hub of cryptography, an invisible front line where intelligence officers worked tirelessly, often without recognition. Maggie, one of the few female codebreakers in the unit, had a knack for spotting patterns where others saw only noise. Her fingers flew over the teletype, converting indecipherable Japanese kana into Romanized letters and then into English. Days bled into nights. The aurora borealis flickered overhead, a cold reminder that the land outside was as unpredictable as the messages within. Sometimes the codes were urgent, an approaching fleet, or a reconnaissance sortie that could jeopardize entire operations. Other times, they were riddles designed to mislead, intended to stretch American patience and ingenuity. Early radar experiments complemented the work of the code breakers. Alaska's vast expanses and unpredictable weather made conventional observation nearly impossible. Engineers installed primitive radar sets on Kodiak Island, Cold Bay, and remote outposts along the Aleutian chain. These devices, bulky and unreliable, often failed under the weight of snow or the battering of coastal winds. Yet they were a window into enemy movements, a technological edge that, in a place where visibility could drop to zero in seconds, meant life or death. One particularly tense night, a radar operator named Harold Jensen spotted blips on the screen approaching Dutch Harbor. The storm outside roared like an angry beast, making it impossible for visual confirmation. Jensen's voice trembled as he relayed the coordinates to Anchorage, where Maggie and her team scrambled to decode intercepted Japanese orders that might correspond to the movement. Hours later, a Japanese reconnaissance flight attempted a surprise over the harbor, but was met with prepared defenses thanks entirely to the silent collaboration of radar operators and code breakers hundreds of miles apart. Espionage in Alaska was not confined to signals and machines. Field agents worked in near total isolation, disguised as trappers, fishermen, or surveyors. They mapped supply lines, observed troop movements, and sometimes engaged in dangerous contact with locals who might unknowingly be informants. These operatives risked frostbite, starvation, and capture in an environment where enemy forces and the land itself were equally deadly. Captain Richard Hall once recounted trekking across snowdrifts 20 feet high to deliver a microfilm containing critical intelligence on Japanese fortifications. He emerged frostbitten, exhausted, and alone, but the information he carried saved countless lives on the front. Anchorage's intelligence hub also became a testing ground for cryptographic innovations. Collier cipher machines,
code books, and improvised scrambling devices were used to encode outbound messages to field agents and Soviet allies under the Lend-Lease program. The Japanese, in turn, constantly refined their encryption, creating a cat-and-mouse game of mathematical ingenuity and relentless persistence. Maggie often worked 14-hour shifts, sipping bitter coffee, piecing together fragmented transmissions that could reveal the enemy's next move. Mistakes could be catastrophic. One misread symbol might send a bomber unit into a deadly trap or leave an Aleutian outpost vulnerable to assault. Despite the high stakes, humor and camaraderie found their way into the frozen offices. Cryptographers exchanged stories of absurd mistakes, decoding a message about sushi supply lines only to realize it referred to strategic fuel depots. Engineers joked about radar antennas dancing in the storms. But beneath the levity lay an unshakable awareness. The cold front of espionage was as unforgiving as any battle on land or sea. Every intercepted transmission, every successful detection directly impacted soldiers who froze in foxholes or pilots navigating treacherous mountain passes. One of the most remarkable stories involved a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Paul Yamamoto, who, despite being only 22, uncovered a Japanese plan to deploy reconnaissance submarines near the Aleutian chain. The plan, if executed, could have compromised American supply lines critical to the defense of Attu and Kiska. Using a combination of decoded messages and early radar tracking, Yamamoto's team issued warnings to naval units, which intercepted the subs before they could gather meaningful intelligence. The operation remained classified for decades, but it exemplified how Alaska's silent war required not just courage, but intellect and quick thinking.
Field operations were equally harrowing. Alaska's climate did not forgive mistakes. Agents often traveled hundreds of miles over frozen rivers, across glaciers, and through dense spruce forests, carrying radio equipment, cipher pads, and occasionally weapons for self-defense. One agent, Sergeant Elena Vasquez, recounts trekking through a blizzard for 3 days to deliver a decoded message warning of an impending Japanese reconnaissance flight. Her fingers were numb, her boots frozen solid, yet she pressed on, knowing that failure could result in the loss of lives stationed hundreds of miles away. While the soldiers on the Aleutian front endured artillery fire and machine guns, spies faced a war waged in shadows, where miscalculation meant disappearance rather than capture. Messages were smuggled across frozen waterways, hidden in barrels of fish, were sewn into the linings of coats. Radio transmissions were brief and encrypted. A single lapse could allow the enemy to triangulate an operator's position. The cold front of espionage was silent, invisible, but its stakes were as high as any gunfight. By late 1943, the cumulative effect of intelligence operations began to manifest. American forces gained a distinct advantage in anticipating Japanese movements, particularly in remote Aleutian islands where traditional reconnaissance was nearly impossible. Radar stations detected incoming flights, code breakers intercepted strategic orders, and field agents relayed critical information. The synergy of these operations meant that American and Canadian forces could mount counterattacks with precise knowledge, minimizing losses in battles that would otherwise have been devastating. Maggie Collins reflected on one mission that exemplified the invisible war. Japanese signals indicated an impending attack on Dutch Harbor. Within hours, radar confirmed the presence of reconnaissance planes, and field reports identified suspicious supply movements. The coordinated intelligence effort allowed the U.S. military to reinforce defenses just in time. When the Japanese aircraft arrived, they were met with prepared anti-aircraft fire. The engagement was brief, but decisive. To the outside world, it appeared as a standard military success,
But the real victory had been achieved in anchorage offices and on frozen trails, far from prying eyes. Even after the Aleutian campaign ended, Alaska's contributions to intelligence remained critical. The early radar experiments informed post-war technological development, contributing to the nascent Cold War defenses of the Arctic. Cryptographic techniques tested in Anchorage influenced future operations across the globe, and the men and women who had risked life and limb in freezing temperatures were largely unrecognized for decades, their stories classified or forgotten in official records. Yet their legacy endured. Captain Hall, Lieutenant Yamamoto, Sergeant Vasquez, and Lieutenant Collins represented a generation of Americans who understood that war was fought not just with guns, but with knowledge, courage, and adaptability. Alaska had been their crucible, a place where intelligence officers learned to read the land, the sky, and the enemy with equal acuity. In many ways, the state itself had become a silent participant in the conflict, a guardian, a challenge, and a harsh teacher. Today, visitors to Alaska may see only serene mountains and frozen seas. Few know that beneath that quiet exterior, a war of shadows once raged. The Bering Sea winds that whistle through Anchorage carry echoes of Morse code, radar pings, and whispered messages that determined the course of battles far from the front lines. The cold front of espionage was fought not in headlines or public celebrations, but in secrecy, perseverance, and intellect. The story of Alaska's spies, codebreakers, and radar pioneers reminds us that heroism takes many forms. Some fought openly in the snow and mud. Others operated in silence, their victories invisible, but no less vital. They proved that in war, information could be as lethal as any artillery shell, and that courage often meant staring down isolation, cold, and uncertainty. Maggie Collins retired decades later, her hands still trembling when she recounted intercepted messages that had saved hundreds of lives. Sergeant Vasquez returned home with frostbite scars she never spoke of. And Lieutenant Yamamoto quietly carried the knowledge that his decisions had altered the course of battles. Alaska's silent war had demanded brilliance, bravery, and endurance, and those who survived became its quiet champions. In the end, the cold front of espionage was a testament to the unseen side of warfare. The battles fought in rooms, laboratories, and frozen trails. The victories achieved not with gunfire, but with ingenuity, tenacity, and resolve. And while the world may have forgotten many of these heroes, Alaska, the land of ice, wind, and shadowed valleys, remembers. Its silent mountains and endless tundra bear witness to the invisible war that shaped history and the brave souls who fought it in the cold.
Echoes beneath the ice. The wind howled across the Aleutian peaks, carrying the bitter scent of snow and salt. Somewhere beneath that endless white, the remnants of a forgotten battle lay trapped in ice and memory. Corporal James Whitaker knelt beside a half-buried aircraft fuselage, brushing away layers of frost to reveal the faded insignia of a P-40 Warhawk. The metal was jagged, sharp with corrosion, yet it still bore witness. Alaska's war had faded from newspapers and history books, but here, beneath the ice and tundra, its echoes remained alive. In June 1942, the Aleutian Islands became the northernmost battleground of World War II. Japanese forces invaded Attu and Kiska, marking the first foreign occupation of U.S. soil in over a century. While the battles of Europe and the Pacific captured headlines, few Americans understood the enormity of the struggle on their northern frontier. Soldiers and airmen faced not only the enemy, but the relentless forces of nature itself. Blizzards could bury entire units overnight, Winds tore through barracks and stripped equipment bare. Frostbite claimed lives before combat even began. Alaska was a battlefield, yes, but it was also a crucible of endurance and survival. The initial Japanese landings were swift and calculated. On Kiska, they entrenched themselves with surprising efficiency, fortifying bunkers and camouflaging artillery among snow-covered ridges. Reconnaissance was near impossible in the Aleutians' unpredictable weather, giving the occupiers a tactical advantage. American forces, unprepared for such harsh conditions, scrambled to establish supply lines and air support across hundreds of miles of ice and fog. Every mile gained was earned through grit, improvisation, and an intimate understanding of the unforgiving terrain. Corporal James Whitaker remembered stories from veterans who had served in the Aleutians. Men described digging foxholes in frozen ground, their hands bleeding from frostbite, only to have the trenches collapse under the weight of nightly snow. Aircraft were often grounded for days by sudden storms, leaving pilots stranded on airstrips with nothing but tents, rations, and determination. Naval supply convoys fought not only the Japanese threat, but treacherous waters filled with icebergs and unpredictable currents. Alaska itself seemed to conspire against both sides, turning every operation into a battle against nature. Despite these obstacles, the U.S. military gradually regained the initiative. Intelligence work in Anchorage and other bases allowed for early warnings of Japanese movements. Code breakers intercepted transmissions, and early radar experiments provided glimpses of approaching aircraft, even in near-zero visibility. Soldiers on the ground relied on native guides, whose knowledge of the island's hidden trails and weather patterns proved invaluable. Every victory, every reclaimed ridge, every repelled assault was a testament not just to bravery, but to strategy, ingenuity, and the raw determination to survive against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Attu in May 1943 was particularly brutal. Japanese soldiers had fortified their positions across ridges and cliffs, using caves and foxholes as natural bunkers. The Americans faced machine gun nests concealed behind snowdrifts and artillery positioned to exploit every natural slope. Snowstorms struck without warning, often reducing visibility to a few feet and turning the battlefield into a white labyrinth. Combat casualties were high, but many more soldiers suffered from frostbite, exhaustion, and exposure. Reports described soldiers digging their own graves, only to use them as temporary shelters from the storm. Survival became as important as victory. Amid the chaos, stories of courage emerged. Lieutenant Margaret Reynolds led a squad through a narrow pass, under fire and freezing temperatures, to flank a Japanese stronghold. Corporal Takashi Nakamura, an interpreter and liaison with local scouts, navigated treacherous ravines to deliver critical intelligence to command. Even the pilots faced unimaginable challenges. P-38s and P-39s flew missions through blinding snowstorms, engines struggling in thin, frigid air, while navigators relied on compasses that froze over and landmarks buried under snow. Every success was paid for in blood and perseverance. By late 1943, the Japanese evacuated Kiska under cover of fog and darkness, leaving behind supplies, fortifications, and a landscape scarred by months of battle. For the Americans, the victory was bittersweet. Hundreds had died or been wounded, and the harshness of the Aleutian environment had taken its toll. But the campaign had proven Alaska's strategic importance and taught the military invaluable lessons in cold weather operations, logistics, and combined arms tactics. After the war, Much of Alaska's battlefield was reclaimed by snow and time. Bunkers collapsed, airstrips were buried, and wrecked planes sank into frozen ground. Veterans returned home to quiet lives, rarely sharing the full extent of their experiences. The Aleutian campaign faded from public memory, overshadowed by more famous battles in Europe and the Pacific. Yet beneath the ice, the land retained its secrets. Planes, ammunition, foxholes, and sometimes the final resting places of those who had fallen far from home. In the 1950s and 1960s, exploratory teams began uncovering some of these remnants. Archaeologists and military historians documented wrecked aircraft, rusted artillery, and decayed bunkers. Occasionally, skeletal remains were found in snowdrifts, testaments to soldiers who had succumbed not to bullets, but to cold and isolation. Each discovery sparked a renewed interest in the Aleutian campaign, providing insight into the human cost and the extreme conditions faced by those who served.
Corporal Whitaker, now an aging historian and researcher, spent years piecing together these stories. He traveled to remote outposts, combing through archives, veterans' accounts, and physical evidence. Every artifact told a story: a dog tag buried in frozen earth, a helmet dented by artillery, a pilot's logbook cracked with ice. He realized that Alaska's war was not just about the battles fought, but about endurance, adaptation, and the silent struggle between human ambition and nature's immutable power. The echoes beneath the ice also revealed unexpected human connections. Letters recovered from abandoned campsites spoke of camaraderie, fear, and hope. Soldiers wrote to loved ones about their longing for home, the terror of sudden storms, and the small victories that kept them alive. Even Japanese soldiers left behind notes in hidden bunkers, sometimes expressing exhaustion, duty, or a fleeting desire for peace. The frozen landscape became a silent witness to the shared humanity of all who endured it. Modern-day researchers and adventurers continue to uncover Alaska's wartime relics. Sunken ships, hidden foxholes, and aircraft wrecks have been located through sonar, ice-penetrating radar, and exploratory dives in frigid waters. Each find sparks a story, a connection between past and present, reminding Americans that Alaska's role in World War II extended far beyond the maps of conventional battlefields. It was a theater of resilience, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Alaska itself remains a character in these stories. Its mountains, glaciers, and winds were as much an adversary as the Japanese forces. Soldiers learned to read the snow, anticipate blizzards, and respect the limits of their own endurance. Pilots navigated invisible corridors above ice fields, relying on instinct and training. Spies and scouts moved silently through hidden valleys. Their survival depended on local knowledge and ingenuity. The land tested every visitor, demanding courage, humility, and perseverance. Whitaker reflected on one particular site, the remains of a small airstrip on Attu, half buried in ice and moss. He imagined the pilots who had landed there during storms, exhausted yet determined. He thought of soldiers digging foxholes in frozen ground, and codebreakers working in anchorage offices, unseen but critical to the war effort. The physical remnants, the twisted metal, the collapsed bunkers, the frozen graves, were proof that history was not just written in books, but etched into the very landscape itself. Alaska's Aleutian campaign may be a footnote in textbooks, but for those who served, its significance was monumental. It demonstrated the importance of strategic foresight, cold weather warfare, and combined arms operations in extreme conditions. It highlighted the ingenuity and resilience of human beings in the face of nearly insurmountable obstacles, and it left a legacy that endures, not only in military history, but in the land itself. Today, visitors to Alaska can hike through serene wilderness, unaware of the history beneath their feet. A bend in a river, a ridge along the coast, or a frozen lagoon may conceal remnants of a time when America's northern frontier was a bulwark against invasion.
Archaeologists and historians continue to uncover evidence, each discovery a reminder that the past is not truly buried. It waits beneath ice, snow, and memory. The echoes beneath the ice are not silent. They speak of bravery and isolation, ingenuity and adversity, and the quiet perseverance that shaped the course of history. They remind us that every battle leaves traces, not just in human lives, but in the land itself. Alaska, vast and unyielding, stands as both witness and participant, a frozen testament to the sacrifices made when freedom hung in the balance. Corporal Whitaker, as he carefully cataloged a rusted P-40 Warhawk, paused to reflect. The guns had fallen silent decades ago, yet the land still spoke. The bunkers, the wrecked planes, the untold graves, they whispered stories of courage, of endurance, of lives committed to duty in the coldest and most remote reaches of America. And in listening to the echoes beneath the ice, he understood something profound. The Aleutian campaign was not just history, it was memory made tangible, survival made visible, and heroism preserved in snow and stone. Alaska's northern frontier, once a silent guardian of freedom, continues to hold these stories, waiting for those willing to listen. The war may have ended, but the land remembers. And for anyone who dares to uncover its secrets, the echoes beneath the ice speak with clarity. Courage, sacrifice, and resilience endure beyond the headlines, beyond memory, and beyond the snow itself.